Good afternoon. My name is Rudy El-Khoury. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Miami. Delighted to welcome you all to the virtual symposium, Wood and Everything After, hosted by the Lou Lab of the School of Architecture. This is a very timely and much appreciated event because it aligns perfectly with the school's strategic investment in sustainability and resilience, a strategy that makes sense, of course, given our situation here, our position in South Florida, the uh, ground zero for climate change impacts. So the school, as part of this effort, is expanding its scope by engaging in conversations and collaborations across its traditional disciplinary boundaries. And LULAB has done a great deal in sustaining such efforts, as evidenced in initiating this forum and many other projects that really are making a difference for our school and community. We are grateful to all the researchers, educators, and practitioners committing the valuable time to bring their knowledge and insight to this forum, and to the audience joining us from around the world. Actually, this was meant to be an in-person event. It's now virtual, but I think we benefit now by reaching a wider audience in the virtual arena. We want to thank the US Forestry Department and the Wood Innovations Grant Program for supporting the development of the Lou Labs Wood initiatives at UM and for enabling this conversation here. Thank you again for joining us, and I turn now to the organizers of the symposium.
Thank you, Dean El-Khoury. We greatly appreciate your introductory thoughts and, most importantly, your support for the Lou Labs initiatives to build culture of wood and wood thinking at the University of Miami School of Architecture. So on behalf of the entire Lou Lab team behind the assembly of the Wood and Everything After Symposium, we would like to both welcome and thank all of you for your interest in our initiatives. I'm going to begin today by offering a short but punchy statement by Gregor Bateson, the English anthropologist. He states, the organism that destroys itself or destroys its environment destroys itself. The very direct connection Bateson makes between the longevity of our species to its stewardship of the environment's health places enormous pressure on our ability as humans to take seriously the responsibility for our decisions, conscious and unconscious. It is clear that we need to do better at understanding the natural environment for which we extract our built environment. Currently, we are in an extreme state of imbalance. Thus, in the interest of the long-term sustained existence, humans are going to need to find humility and start looking for the forest amongst the trees. The objective of this symposium is to offer a platform to the myriad of voices representative of the agenda for wood architecture. The Lou Lab posits the impending environmental pressures associated with the rapidly changing climate have heightened the need for a more comprehensive approach to energy and architecture. The cast of characters assembled before you exemplifies the thought leaders and practitioners committed to advancing the elements that make up the construction ecology of wood buildings and the pursuit for a more comprehensive approach to architecture and environment. It is the belief of the Lou Lab that the discipline of architecture must listen closely to the upstream conversations happening in and around forestry, resource extraction, land and water management, energy, exergy, carbon, logistics, processing, manufacturing, and material science, if we are to design productive wood buildings that address the severity of climate change. Lastly, I would like to thank all of the presenters who, without hesitation, committed to joining the Wood and Everything After Symposium. We are deeply appreciative of the willingness to share their knowledge and grateful to the commitment they have all displayed in advancing the knowledge of wood architecture. Additionally, the Lou Lab is grateful for the support of the US Forestry Department and their Wood Innovation Grant Program for the commitment to our initiatives, as without their contributions, our symposium simply would not happen. So some logistical things as we begin here. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to the Lou Lab at littoralurbanismlab@miami.edu. You can also track our work on Instagram at lou_lab_Miami. Our team will do the best to respond to your questions in a timely fashion as we're working through the symposium. Additionally, we will be posting some links. So you will find links to each panelist event, both in the Eventbrite page and the detailed program. We will post these links in the chat for the attending audience. For questions, please enter your questions through the Q&A tool, and the panel moderators will organize your questions for our lecturers. We highly encourage you to reach out to us through the Q&A so we can have an active discussion at the end of the presentations. We will do our best to address all questions. However, if we are forced to end the sessions based on a lot of time, we will try to get answers to your questions and post them in the Miro board. So the Miro board is also another active thing that we try to associate with the symposium that will provide you additional information. So we'll put a link to the Wood and Everything Actor interactive web space hosted at Miro in the chat. You can access additional information about the symposium, projects that are currently happening at the University of Miami School of Architecture, and you can also find a way to place questions in there. Again, feel free to reach out to us at the Littoral Urbanism Lab at miami.edu. Okay, on to the kind of symposium prompt, if you will. The symposium is structured in 3 tracks. And for those of you that have looked over the program, you'll understand that a little bit better across the next couple of days. So track 1 is the industry critical systems, defined as ecology, energy, and economics. Track 2 is titled making, material, tectonic, and building technologies. Track 3 is a retrospective and projective dialogue. So we'll be moving through those across the next day and a half, if you will, and hopefully they'll make sense at the end. We're also very, very fortunate to have 2 keynote speakers, Alan Organsky from Gray Organsky Architects and the Timber City Initiative, and Dean Peter McKeith from the University of Arkansas Fay Jones School of Architecture. So track 1, industry critical systems, ecology, energy, and economics. For a brief introduction to that, we understand these 3 titles to represent some very specific things. So solid wood buildings and subsequently their assemblies require large material batteries, industrial manufacturing processes, robust transportation infrastructures, and long-term planning processes for the resource of our timber management systems. These critical elements in the wood processing cycles are dependent on a balanced approach to supply and demand. As the North American wood industry is primed for rapid expansion, a planned structure from raw material resource through the construction of buildings should be established now. Current wood reserves, processing capacity, and building demands have room to expand. However, as the scale of wood industry increases, the resulting economic models and timber futures will become disrupted or potentially dislodged. Engaging ecologists, which is what we're going to start with the forestry departments, industry partners, energy consultants, and economics, we will be critical to comprehensive approach to the solid wood building agenda. So with that, as our first track starts, I would like to welcome Laura Bosworth, the Director of the Forestry and Regulatory Affairs for the Florida Forestry Association, to introduce our first speakers. Laura?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the introduction, and we really do appreciate the University of Miami School of Architecture and the Lou Lab creating the space to have these dialogues and this knowledge exchange between those who create sustainable wood products and those who use them. This has been a great learning experience for me from the very beginning. We have 3 great speakers here today to talk to you about ecology and forestry. Our first speaker today is Dr. Jarek Novak from the Florida Forest Service. He is the Forest Utilization and Hydrology Section Supervisor in the out of their Tallahassee office. In this position, he oversees forest utilization, forest inventory analysis, and their forest water resource programs, which include both the silvicultural and wildlife BMP programs. Prior to his service with the Florida Forest Service, Dr. Novak worked as a forest extension specialist and researcher at the University of Florida's North Florida Research and Education Center in Quincy, Florida. Dr. Novak holds a PhD degree in forestry with a minor in soils from Mississippi State University, as well as an MS degree in forestry from Virginia Tech, as well as his homeland country of Poland from the Warsaw Agricultural University. He's a proud father of 2 Eagle Scouts and a husband of 30 years to a fellow Mississippi grad. And in his spare time, Jarek enjoys sailing in Florida coastal waters and alpine style skiing in the northern latitudes. He's here today to talk a little bit about the basic characteristics and the economic importance of Florida's forests.
Thank you, Laura, for this generous introduction. Somehow it sounded very familiar. It's my life. All right, I'll try to share my screen now and open my PowerPoint. Do you see my screen? Can everybody see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet, no.
Okay, I was. All right, let's try again. So the way we did it in the practice session was I did that, then click share and open my PowerPoint.
This is working. Thank you, Jarek.
Okay, sure. Good afternoon. So I think I would like to maybe turn my video off. That may help me focus on my presentation. Welcome. I am honored to be presenting to your symposium, Wood and Everything After, at the University of Miami. Again, my name is Jarek Novak and I work for the Florida Forest Service. I would like to talk to you about basic forestry characteristics in Florida and also its economic importance in the state. This is a rather long definition of forestry, but I think I would like to focus your attention on few key words. So forestry basically deals with forests, with sustainable manner of dealing with the forest, and also concentrates on forest management and conservation. So basically, forest management and conservation are the takeaways. The mission of the Florida Forest Service, the organization I work for, is to protect Florida and its people from dangers of wildland fire and manage the forest resources through a stewardship ethic to assure they are available for future generations. So this is our guiding statement and guiding document in everything we do in forestry in Florida. And to introduce you to how the forests are distributed throughout Florida, this is a map with counties in Florida. And the darker the green color, the more forests in that particular county. So as you can see, most forests in Florida are located in the northern half of the state. And as we move past Orlando, Orange County and below, the rate of forest appearance decreases substantially. And where our hosts are located in Miami-Dade County, forests are only about 10% of land area or less. So when foresters talk about forests, we like to group forests in the larger categories, which help us manage the land and also the forest resources. So first of all, Florida has about 17 million acres of forest land, 8 million acres of pine forests, and within that, about 5.7 million acres of pine plantations. That means those were the forests that were created intentionally by planting trees. We also have about 7.7 million acres of hardwood forests, and we have about 1 million acre of cypress forests. So again, back to my previous slide, if you look at the Northwest and Northeast Florida, that's home of about 70% of all Florida forests. But overall, forest lands are about 50% of terrestrial Florida, which, living south of Orlando may not be so apparent. So this is an example of a pine forest in northern Florida. And here we're looking at longleaf pine and slash pine. This is, what you can encounter traveling to the state. The hardwood bottomland forest may look something like this, which, the main feature is the hardwood broadleaf trees and usually quite a bit of water flowing through them. This is an example of a cypress forest, which may be familiar to those living close to Miami, as you're near the big Cypress National Preserve to your west. And this is another type of forest in Florida, which is a mangrove forest. It's unique to only a few states in Florida. It's unique to only a few states in the United States. Florida is one of them. Louisiana has a little bit of it, and also Texas. We don't use those forests for timber resources. However, they have enormous ecological importance because they protect coastlines from storm surge, hurricanes, and all manner of things. So back to the forest resources in Florida. Like I mentioned, there is 17 million acres of forest land. And here, it's important to point out that private forests, both private family forests and private corporate forests, compose about 65% of all Florida forests. Federal government owns about 15% of Florida forests, and state government 17%. Only about 3% is owned by municipalities and local county governments. This is important because ownership often dictates the management objectives or what the mission of that forest might be. The owners of the forest dictate what is happening on the ground. So here is an example of a private forest where harvest happens, and then this wood may end up in a facility like the one on the upper left, where logs are processed into boards. So it's also important for the theme of our symposium to talk about sustainability. On the left here, you see major 4 categories of forest products extracted from Florida's forests. It is pine pulpwood, pine saw timber, hardwood pulpwood, hardwood saw timber, and then a total. So in the next column, you see the net timber growth in tons, then timber removals in tons, and the sustainability index is computed by dividing net timber growth by timber removals. So as you see, for pine pulpwood, we grow about 30% more than we remove. For pine saw timber, we have 80% more than we remove. And for hardwood, the picture looks even better because we grow 3 times as much hardwood pulpwood as we're removing it. And from hardwood saw timber, that ratio is almost 24. So anyway, overall, Florida forests are sustainable at about a ratio of 2, meaning we're growing twice as much wood as we're harvesting. And how do we know all those things? Well, it's because of the forest inventory and analysis in case of Florida mostly, because this is the program which pretty much since 1935 measures the forest resources in Florida and other states throughout the country. So we're currently in our 11th cycle, and I'm not quite sure if I have time to show you everything on this website, but basically forest inventory and analysis is a program, a partnership between state forestry agencies and US Forest Service. And there's a wealth of information here. However, all the data that is collected by our state forest employees working in the program are then crunched and deposited in various compartments here. So for example, you can see a 1-page fact sheet for forests of Florida depicting the major parameters, but you also can see other aspects. For example, this is a fact sheet which shows how much wood is actually getting to Florida mills. So let's see if this is going to open. Well, it looks like the internet decided that we're not going to see that fact sheet. But it's very much like the previous one, except that it shows the wood that is actually, oh, I think I decided to close it. Can you still see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So anyway, I wanted to show you that the sustainability of forests in Florida and throughout the country is on the mind of many people. And both state forestry agencies and the U.S. Forest Service collect data to be sure that while we're utilizing forests, we also sustain them. So here on my next slide, I just wanted to show you some of the examples of wood products that are produced in Florida. So this is primary wood processing facilities in Florida in 2021. And as you can see, we're producing animal bedding, biomass power, small chip and sew, firewood, mulch, oriented strand board, pellets. We have one of the largest pellet plants in Florida. The next larger one is in Georgia. They just edged us a little bit recently. And then we also produce plywood, poles, posts. Pulpwood and paper is still our flagship industry here as far as the wood utilization. We also have 20-some sawmills and we have some veneer mills. This is all to say that we're not producing any of the mass timber products such as CLT that Chris Meyer and his lab would like to perhaps see coming out of Florida forest as well. And this is the network of the secondary wood processing facilities, and there is about 340 of them, which is quite impressive. We were not even quite sure how many there are when we embarked on this project back in 2014. So as you see, there are some clusters of those secondary industries that take, say, boards or plywood or processed wood and do something else with it. So they are clustered around Tampa, St. Petersburg, Miami, and Orlando. So now to the next theme of my presentation, which is the economic importance. By our last analysis that was done by the University of Florida for us, forestry industry jobs in 2018 totaled about 124,000. And most of those jobs were in paper products, about 47%, wood products, 21%, 13% is forestry production. So that's basically production such as going to the woods, extracting resources from the forest. So that's only 13% of the forestry-based economy. And then there are smaller percentages for wholesale trade, forestry chemicals, wood machinery, and biomass power. So all in all, when economists crunch the numbers, in 2018, total output of all forest-based products in Florida totaled $25 billion. Economists prefer to use the value added as an indicator of the economic activity, and that number is around $11 billion for Florida. And then, of course, there is labor income, which is about 6.6, federal taxes and state taxes, which are over $2.5 billion together. As far as the environmental sustainability aspects of forestry, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about best management practices. So all southern states, including Florida, have a program called Best Management Practices. That means that it's pretty much codified in each state what kind of forest operations are acceptable and which are not acceptable. So in that arena, we in Florida deal with special management zones, public lands, wetlands, canals, sinkholes, forest roads, stream crossings, timber harvesting, site preparation and planting, fire line construction, pesticide and fertilizer application, waste disposal, wet weather operations, and emergency operations. So that's 14 BMP categories, and 150 different best management practices are evaluated on a regular basis in Florida. Florida also has a forestry wildlife BMP program, which is rather unique. I think we're the only southern state that has it right now. And in that program, we're evaluating 10 aquatic species, 2 burrowing animals, gopher tortoise and burrowing owl, and 4 nesting birds species, little blue heron, tricolor heron, Florida sandhill crane, and southeastern kestrel. So in summary, I would like to offer that forests are approximately 50% of terrestrial Florida. Florida forests are sustainable with timber growth exceeding removals by 2 to 1. Florida forests support 124,000 jobs, generate 25 billion in economic output, and 11 billion in value added. And my organization, the Florida Forest Service, is committed to promoting sound forest stewardship practices throughout the state. So that concludes my presentation, and I hope I didn't overuse my time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Novak, for your time today. Chris, if it's all right, I'll jump in and move on to our next speaker here.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. So up next, we're very lucky to have Scott Phillips from the South Carolina Forestry Commission join us today. Scott Phillips is the state forester of the South Carolina Forestry Commission, and as the agency head, he stays very busy providing oversight for all the functions of the agency, as well as the day-to-day operations. He represents the Forestry Commission and South Carolina's forestry industry interests at the state, regional, and national level. He earned a Bachelor's of Science of Forest Resources from the University of Georgia, where he dual majored in forestry and wildlife management, and then received his Master of Forest Resources from Clemson University, specializing in forest business. Scott's a registered forester in South Carolina and has over 20 years of experience managing forest land and serves as the current chair for the Southern Group of State Foresters. He's here today to talk to us a little bit about the state of forestry in South Carolina and how building with wood products supports sustainable forests, not only in South Carolina, but the southeastern region.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and to give a quick update from the South Carolina perspective. My talk's gonna be a little bit different than Jarek's talk. As a state forester and the current chair of the Southern Group of State Foresters, I want to give you a little bit broader perspective about our forest. And with the first part of this meeting focusing on critical systems, I thought it would be really appropriate to format my talk as a pulse check. So we're going to do a pulse check on the forest in South Carolina and the southern region. I really don't know who to give the credit to, but I was impressed that the opening track of this meeting is titled Industry Critical Systems. Because from my perspective, our southern forests are critical systems, or as I like to think about them, critical infrastructure, much like our interstate highway systems and our power grids. Our forests provide social, environmental, economic benefits to our region, benefits like clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, places to recreate, beautiful landscapes, while simultaneously providing wood that is used for a vast array of products and while creating jobs and strong economies. During my brief time with you today, I want to give you a quick look at the state of our forest in the southeastern United States, and more specifically, what our forests look like in South Carolina. I'm also going to touch on the markets and economic impact of forestry in our region and in South Carolina. And then I'll talk just briefly on sustainability. And hopefully by the time I complete this presentation, you'll be able to connect how building with wood supports the long-term sustainability of our forest in the South. In the 13 southern states, there are about 232 million acres of forest. And these forests cover about 40% of the land area in our region. If you'll take a look at the map there, you'll notice it would be much higher if we didn't have West Texas and Oklahoma there. There's not forest out there in those areas, but in the vast majority of the Southeast, we have a lot of forest. These forests are very productive and diverse. supporting a very strong forest industry and a very efficient timber supply chain. The South is known as the wood basket of the world, producing about 20% of the global pulp supply and about 7% of the global roundwood. This generates about $250 billion of annual economic impact and supports more than 1 million jobs in our region. The vast majority of the forest in the South are 87% of them are privately owned, with more than 5 million private forest owners in the Southeast. So if you want to have an impact on the conservation of forest in the South, you must engage with private forest landowners. South Carolina's got an abundant forest resource. We have about 12.9 million acres of forest land, which is about 2 million acres more than we had in 1936. Our forests cover about 67% of the state's land area, with 87% of the forest being privately owned. 63% of this acreage is owned by families, just like you and I. So again, if we want to conserve these forests, we must engage private landowners. South Carolina's forests are healthy and diverse, with about 52% of our forests being hardwood types and 48% being pine. 24% of our forests are planted pine, which is really important, as these planted pine stands are more actively managed and produce more than 50% of the timber supply. Our forests continue to grow more wood than is being harvested, with a growth drain ratio for pine of 1.3. That means that we're growing 30% more pine than we're harvesting. And when we look at hardwood, we're growing about 60% more wood than we're harvesting. On this next slide, there's a couple points I want you to note while we're looking at this. First, looking at the bars, forested acres have been stable between 12 and 13 million acres for decades in South Carolina. This goes from 1936 all the way up to 2018. And our forest land has been very stable. And then second, looking at the line, you'll see that the standing inventory has increased while our acreage has stayed relatively constant. In fact, we continue to break records and currently have more standing volume of wood in South Carolina than ever recorded. And at the same time, we're harvesting more wood than ever recorded. This graph depicts timber product output removals within our state from 1936 to 2017. I want you to remember this point, that we have more standing volume and we're harvesting more wood than at any point in our recorded history. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. Note that most of the wood in South Carolina, produced in South Carolina, goes into pulpwood for making paper products, and saw logs, which are used to make lumber, with smaller components going into veneer, composites, poles, and bioenergy. So now that we have a feel for the state of our forest resources, I want to get a pulse check on our industry's economic impact. I've already mentioned that forestry is big business in the South, producing an annual economic impact of greater than $250 billion. Based on the 2019 report in South Carolina completed by Dr. Tim Adams and his team, forestry continues to be a pillar of South Carolina's economy, with a $21.2 billion economic impact. And in our state, it ranks #1 in terms of jobs, supporting more than 98,000 jobs. #2 in terms of labor income, supporting a wealth of high-paying jobs for South Carolina citizens. And #3 in direct economic output, which is based on the value of our industry's production. One of the cool things about forestry, and one of the things that really makes our industry stand out, is the footprint in our state. Forestry contributes to the economy of every county in our state, with primary mills, secondary mills, and forest landowners and forest businesses spread through every community in South Carolina. Jarek mentioned a while ago the number of primary mills in Florida. In South Carolina, we have 100 primary mills and nearly 800 secondary mills within our state. So they're prolific within our state. They're everywhere across the state of South Carolina, creating a positive economic impact on our forest while at the same time providing clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, and beauty that draws our people and businesses to our state. Forestry really is an ideal industry. Okay, so we've established that we have a lot of forest land in the South and an abundant supply of timber, and that forestry is a big business. So how can building with wood help sustain forest in the South? I want to start with a quote here from Dr. Carl Schenck in his 1909 book on forest finance, which is based on lectures that he delivered at the Biltmore Forestry School. Dr. Schenck wrote, with the private owner of forest, the financial outcome of his investments is the first and last consideration. The private owner cannot be expected to supply this country with forest products unless forestry is as remunerative as an investment as agriculture. To boil that down, forests are like any other capital investment, and the asset must pay its way. If the landowner can't realize a return on his investment, he will seek alternative investments. To conserve forest in the South, private landowners are critical. There was a study done by Forest to Market a few years ago that conducted an in-depth analysis on the relationship between demand and forest productivity in the United States South, looking at Forest Service data from 1953 through 2015. What they found was that strong markets and increased demand for wood encouraged private landowners to invest in the productivity improvements that dramatically increased the wood supply. From 1953 to 2015, the amount of timberland in the United States has been relatively stable. You can see that in the line here on the graph, that acres are about within 3% across that range. During this period, economic growth and increased construction ramped up demand for forest products, increasing harvest removals by 57%. Over the same period of time, the standing inventory of our forest increased 108%. That's the light gray in the graph that you see there. This may remind you of the point that I made just a minute ago when looking at South Carolina data, where we have record timber inventories while at the same time we're harvesting more wood than ever recorded in our state. So increased demand led to increasing returns on investment, which led to more investment and more inventory. In fact, investments in silviculture and genetic improvements over the last several decades have resulted in a 4 times increase in the productivity of today's planted stands versus those planted in the 1950s. This is important. That's what will allow us to grow more wood on fewer acres in the future. Going back to the study from Forest to Market, they also conducted a statistical analysis, and that analysis showed that increased demand in the U.S. South is associated with more acres of forest, better growth, and larger inventories. You can see in the charts, as removals increased, so did the acres, so did the growth, and so did the standing inventory. Very strong correlation between those. Another interesting finding from this report is that from 1989 to 1999, there was a set of data that they could use looking at the conversion of forest from forest to other non-forested uses. And there was about 5.4 million acres that were converted during that time period, that 10-year time period from 89 to 99. Of that acreage, 94% of it, of the forests that were lost, were naturally regenerated forests. They were not planted stands. So higher productivity and more active management may mitigate conversion risk to non-forest. One of our biggest threats to the long-term sustainability of our forests in the South is urbanization. Between 2000 and 2010, urban land area increased about 10 million acres nationwide, with the greatest amount of urban growth occurring right here in the South, in Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina. Urban land area is expected to increase another 95 million acres nationwide by 2060, and 18 states are expected to have an increase in urban land area greater than 2 million acres. This includes South Carolina, where we expect additional 2.3 million acres of urban area by 2060. Much of this area will come from our forests. An analysis by the U.S. Forest Service modeled shifts in private forest land under 4 scenarios with varying levels of urbanization and future values of timber. They're trying to look at how does demand on timber affect urbanization and conversion. If you look at these scenarios on the slide, you'll see that scenario A, with the highest urbanization and the decreasing timber prices, resulted in the largest loss of forest land. While scenario D, with moderate urbanization and increasing timber prices, yield the least conversion. So strong markets for forest products are really important. Okay, so let's wrap this up. I hope in my time you picked up that southern forests are critical infrastructure. They provide tremendous value, things like clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities, and beauty that attracts people to our region, while at the same time providing tremendous economic contributions to our economy and supporting more than 1 million jobs. We have an abundant forest resource to supply the demand for wood, sustain our industry, and provide for continued economic development. Our forests can continue to grow more wood than is being harvested, and continued investment will increase our productive capacity into the future. And finally, building with wood supports markets by incentivizing private landowners to retain and actively manage their forests. As my predecessor, Gene Kadama, the former state forester, liked to say, no markets, no money, no management. The law of supply and demand applies to forestry just like any other business. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your time and sharing that with us. We have 1 speaker left today, and I'd like to encourage the audience to submit questions through the Q&A. We've had a couple good ones come in, so please keep them coming. Up next for our final speaker is Risher Willard with the Georgia Forestry Commission. Risher is the Chief of Forest Services, Utilization, and Marketing for the Georgia Forestry Commission. He focuses there on enhancing the values of Georgia forests and forest products industry. In his 29 years with the GFC, Willard has held a variety of positions, including forester, wildland firefighter, and staff forester. Prior to coming to the GFC, Willard worked in the private sector in sales, marketing, and logistics. Willard earned Bachelor of Science degrees in Forestry and Business Administration from the University of Kentucky and holds his current certification as a Georgia Registered Forester. He's here today to talk a little bit about forestry in Georgia, including some of the forest practices, the resources and sustainability, as well as the economic impacts. And with that, Risher, I'll hand it off to you.
Risher, you might be muted. There we go.
There you go. Well, thank everyone for the invitation to speak today. And my presentation is going to be very similar to Jarek's and Scott's. And let's just jump right into it. Okay. All right, well, Jarek touched on this a little bit, and I think oftentimes forestry is used in a lot of circles when a lot of folks don't know what forestry really is. And I think Jarek touched on it really well. It's an art and it's a science. And the goal of it is to produce products, high quantity on a continuous basis. And it includes lots of different parts, harvesting, manufacturing, marketing, and the use of all those wood products. And the great thing about forestry is, one of the great things is all of these things that we want to do, they're not mutually exclusive. You can manage many of these things all at the same time and achieve the same goals: protecting watersheds, timber production, wildlife, recreation, aesthetics, anything you want to do, you can do in forestry. And it's a very science intensive discipline. And these are just some of the different sciences and disciplines that foresters use on a regular basis that you study about in college. And then when you get out into your career, you learn even more. And these are just some of the things that we use on a daily basis to manage our forests, no matter where they are. And anything from the ground all the way to the sky, that's where we live. Well, a little bit about Georgia. We have about almost 25 million acres of forest land. About 64% of our state is forested. A lot of folks think that the southern states are actually the most percentage-wise forested, but it's not true. Actually, Maine, I believe, is the highest percentage forested state, but as far as acres, we win in the South. We have about 23.8 million acres of timberland. We're number 2 in the US. We kind of flip-flop back and forth with Oregon. They beat us out by a couple of 100,000 acres in the past year. And we're number 1 in private timberland with almost 22 million acres. And you hear a lot of terms about forest land and timberland, and there is a little bit of a difference between those two terms. Forest land is the bigger number. Timberland is a subset of forest land. Forest land could include parks and things like that that might have restrictions on the use of their products. Timberland we equate with commercial timberland. And in Georgia, of the approximately 650 native and naturalized tree species in the US, there's approximately 250 species in Georgia. So we have about 40% of all of the tree species, or the numbers of tree species in the US. Let's talk about sustainability, and the numbers are very similar to South Carolina and Florida. We're blessed with a resource that really grows, and we know how to grow it. Our annual growth exceeds removals for all of our species combined by 48%. And for our pine resource by 32%. And hardwoods is a really big number at 114%. And these are annual percentages. So every year we're growing 48% more wood than we're using in the state. And another great thing is, talking about sustainability is how much are we removing annually? We're only removing about 3% of our total inventory every year. And another metric that is really incredible is we're growing about 2.4 tons of wood per second in the state. And what does that really mean? I can't visualize what a ton means, but if you've ever seen a log truck in the South that has tree length logs on it, there's about 26 tons that can fit on that truck. So about every 11 seconds, we're adding another truckload of wood to our inventory in the state, which is really phenomenal. Let's talk about our roundwood production. And what I mean by that is, what are the products coming from our forests that go to our mills? Pulpwood and sawlogs were the top 2 product types at our Georgia mills, equaling about 79% of our total production. You can see the other products there. There on the right side is a fairly new component to our economy and the use of our wood. about 10 years old, I would say. Forests, and this is 2017 data, accounted for about almost 47 million green tons of timber products in 2017. And 87% of that usage was pines and 13% hardwood. Jumping in a little deeper dive into our sawlog production, you can see that there was quite a decline in starting about in 2009, between 2007 and 9. If you remember back, that's when our financial collapse happened and the housing collapse happened, and the lighter bars are the softwoods, the pines, and the dark bars are the hardwood usage. And we've not recovered. I think there's might be one more bar over here. We've not recovered to our levels back in the late or the middle to late 90s. And if you take this curve out into the future, you know, at the current production that we're using, it's going to take us till about the year 2030 to get back to using the same amount of pine logs that we were back in those late 90 period. If things continue the way they are, we hope they are, but it's been a slow climb back from those really good years. Talking about economic impacts, very similar to our sister states. Our forest industry is a huge economic driver for the state with over 36 billion in output. And that's a metric that's similar to sales. And it supports over 141,000 jobs in the state. Our output, the red bars, have increased for 9 consecutive years, but you can see that that has slowed down over the last 4 or 5 years. Among all Georgia industries, Georgia's forest industry ranks #1 in wages and salaries and #2 in jobs. And another metric that is not shown on this graph is the impacts of urban forestry in Georgia. Urban forestry adds an additional 4.8 billion output and over 48,000 jobs. So combined, the forest industry as a whole, you know, traditional rural forestry plus urban forestry is a huge economic driver in the state of Georgia. And this is my last slide of my presentation. I think Scott and Jarek would agree with me that the subjects that we're talking on right now, we could spend all day on, each of us, and we're just scratching the surface on how important forestry is to our individual states, the South and the US. Talking a little bit about Georgia's wood using industries. You know, the difference between a primary industry and a secondary is that a primary industry is one that where a log with bark on it comes into a mill and is processed into lumber, plywood, telephone poles, you know, things like that. A secondary industry is one that takes those products produced at a lumber mill and then adds value to it through folks making cabinets, doors, moldings, secondary products. So in Georgia, we have about 219 primary processing mills. We have about 1,100 secondary mills in the state. You can see on this graph here on the left side where the hardwoods are shown, about 98 sawmills in Georgia, which is almost half of all of the mills in the state. And as I spoke on briefly earlier, the biomass wood pellets segment is fairly new to the United States. We have about 9 wood pellet plants now. We had the first commercial wood pellet plant started back in 2008. in Georgia. So that was a big, important growth sector for Georgia, and not only Georgia, but the South also. But that is a very quick overview of forestry in Georgia. I look forward to any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you so much, Risher. And that actually concludes our speakers. I'd like to thank our experts again for joining us today and sharing their time, as well as the Lou Lab again and University of Miami School of Architecture, and then the participants on the call today. So we did get some good questions coming in. Chris, if you want to jump on, we can kind of bat these back and forth.
Yep, I'm here. Again, I want to reiterate what Laura just said. So excited to have forestry represented here for the Southeast. Without it, I don't know where we would be. So thank you guys for taking the time to really give us a cross section of these 3 states. It's exciting to hear. Again, I will push what Laura pushed a second ago, which was please put those questions in the chat. We want to hear from you guys. I would assume the forestry department wants to hear from you guys. It's a big question set for us to start answering from the side of architecture. So please throw those questions in the chat. Well, I don't know if you want to start off by anything in particular that's on your mind.
We can move down this line there. We've got 4 or 5 really great questions that have come in through the Q&A.
Yep.
And our first question comes from an anonymous attendee. And they ask the group, as forests do not acknowledge state or other groups' political boundaries, how do you work together to share knowledge and forest resources within the U.S. wood basket?
I'll be glad to tackle that one. You know, while we each have our own wood baskets that we're working in and focused on from a state perspective, we also look at it very much from a regional perspective. We work together a lot. The Southern Group of State Foresters is our regional organization that brings all of our state foresters together. And the Southern Group of State Foresters and each one of our 13 Southern states forestry organizations, we partner very strongly with the U.S. Forest Service and forest industry. So we have, going back to the Southern Group, we have standing committees, and one of those standing committees is our Service Utilization and Marketing Committee, which Jarek's on and Risher served on in the past as well. But we bring those experts together from those 13 Southern states and talk about what those issues are across our state lines. We also, each state has their own forest action plan where we're looking at issues that are specific within our state, but a component of our forest action plans are also what are regional issues, what are cross state line issues, and we all look at what's happening in our neighbors next door and work together as we work through this, because we all are dealing with similar issues. Hopefully that addresses your question.
Thank you, Scott. Did any of the other panelists like to add anything to that?
All right. So the second question here is this, and I love questions like this because it's kind of going right back to I think a very fundamental thing that's been ingrained in almost generationally in varying degrees. So the question is it okay to harvest and effectively store any overproduction of timber to allow for more or new growth promotion, a seamless continuation of carbon sequestration, if you will? If so, are there issues with storage, spatially and for the timber products themselves? I think this actually gets to kind of one of the heart of the questions that deals with just straight up harvesting of the product is still an ecological promotion, if you will, an ecological benefit.
Well, I'll take that. Yeah, I think you can see from the from our slides that we have a very sustainable resource on the ground, and actually we need to use more of that resource that we have. You know, putting them into buildings and structures, and we are constantly seeking new uses for our wood products, and mass timber obviously is going to be one of those in the future. We've been making mass timber for a very long time in the history of the U.S. with large beam structures. Now we're making a lot more new types of technological products, including CLT and all of those types of products. But things are looking bright on the horizon for new product development. It's going to utilize all of this wood growth that we do have.
I'll add on to that one real quick. And so, from the forestry perspective, we look at storing carbon a couple different ways. One is we can store that carbon on the stump. That tree is still growing. That inventory is there. It's still adding carbon. Carbon is, wood is 50% carbon by weight. And so we can store that carbon on the stump of that tree until we're ready to harvest that. And one of the really cool things about wood is that when we harvest that wood, we're not releasing all of that carbon back into the atmosphere. We're storing that carbon in that solid wood, especially if we use that product to go into lumber or new materials like CLT or mass timbers that are coming on. We can store that carbon in that building. And so whenever you build with wood, you're storing carbon, you're locking it up until that building is destroyed or burnt or something like that. So you're locking up that carbon for that period of time. So, that's one of the things about, forest is that there's such a great solution for the carbon issue. And there's so many opportunities for us, and we'll continue to learn more going forward.
So I would just like to add that, like it was alluded to, it's a timing issue. I don't think in real life you have a situation where people would just go harvest and store it away. It has to be driven by demand, and we're welcoming new products such as mass timber to come on the market and be glad to respond to that demand. And that's how we can store carbon for decades in those new wood products that will be then parts of the new buildings and other things.
Yeah, I'll just follow back up on what Jarek just said there real quick. Is it's important to note that, especially with mass timber and the opportunities that are there for mass timber to be used in place of things like steel and in place of things like concrete, where there's opportunities to store that carbon instead of emit carbon. Concrete and steel are making those materials, a lot of carbon is emitted during that process. So we can lock that up and store that carbon a long time by using wood.
Yeah, I think that'll be a wonderful thing to come back to whenever Alan Organsky presents this afternoon as part of our keynote, where he talks about kind of carbon storage in our city. So it's a wonderful point to make. One question I think came in here from Peter Osborne, which I think is a great question for you guys to tackle. How has climate change affected the structure, your state forest and rural forest economies? So can you talk about that from each one of your guys' state's perspective?
You want me to start, Jarek?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so we haven't seen a lot of change and impact to our forest structure to date. I have talked with foresters along the coast, and we have seen some sea level rise. And so we've lost some acreage of forest there where it used to be productive forest is now moving into a maritime type habitat and changing to marsh grass. We're losing those trees along that edge. That's really the only impact I've seen as far as our forest structure right now, is that sea level rise that's occurring out there. I lost the second part of that question, but anyway, I'll stop right there. Oh, markets. The second part was markets. And when you start talking about markets, I really hadn't seen a dramatic increase or a change in our markets, other than these new emerging markets that are coming on right now. Markets for carbon credits or something that's brand new. Well, we've been talking about it for almost 2 decades now, but with varying levels of success in different areas to actually monetize that. We've got some new and inventive ways that are coming out now. Nonprofits are pushing into that space. We're starting to see the government start looking at that a little bit more. And so there'll be more opportunities for small landowners to engage in that carbon credit and generate additional income from their lands in the future. Historically, it's been limited to landowners that were very large in size, had greater than 5,000 acres to be able to capitalize on those carbon markets. And again, kind of going back to my point earlier in my presentation, that, you know, if we want to impact the conservation of forest in the South, we've got to engage private forest landowners. And to do that really, really effectively, we've got to engage those family forest landowners, especially in South Carolina. Our average family forest is 80 acres. And so, you know, that's not very big, definitely not going to be able to qualify for carbon markets under some of those traditional markets that were out there before. But under some of these new initiatives that are coming out now, there's opportunities there for them. And anything that we can do to put dollars into those landowners' pocket to increase the return on their investment is going to help them to sustain that forest and keep that land and forest going long term.
For Florida, I would add that I agree with Scott. The impacts right now seems to be mostly in the coastal forests, and driving around, you can clearly see intrusion of salt water and dying off of some trees. As far as the interior of Florida, we don't see a huge impact yet. And just add that actually the climate change may cut both ways, because increased CO2, believe it or not, could also serve as a CO2 fertilization, and there could be increased growth and combined with temperature increases. However, on the other hand, as the storm's intensity and frequency increases, as we may have seen, you know, in the recent years, we may see more catastrophic events. You know, there's no doubt about it in my mind, at least. So Hurricane Michael is one such an example where Florida in a span of a few hours lost 72 million tons of wood, which is equivalent to our 4-year harvest. So yes, I mean, the future is bright, but it's also uncertain. You know, it's a world we live in. So we'll just have to cope with it and do the best we can as far as, you know, what's coming at us.
And for Georgia, I echo what Scott and Jarek said. We haven't seen much impact from climate change on our forest. There could be some, you know, some regional differences. I think even more important than that is the access to market access for all of our products, whether it's these new carbon markets coming out, whether it's wood pellets, whether it's traditional wood products. Having access to markets domestically and internationally is very important. And we need policies from our state and national leaders that help our forest owners maximize, you know, their production and contribution to our economy, and they can do that with open and free market access. But in short, I have not seen any major climate change issues in Georgia.
Thank you very much for answering that question, for that information, folks. Moving on, we've got a brief comment here from Dan Roach out of Rainier, who would just like to echo some of the sentiments that have been expressed today. Without increasing markets for trees, value will drop and returns will go down. When that happens, forest owners will look for other uses of their land, and it may go into things like housing and retail. Like Scott said, no markets, no management, no forests. To have forests with more annual growth and annual harvests, we need new markets for trees, mass timber, CLT, etc. So thank you, Dan, for your comment. And if any of the panelists would like to add to that, I think it really reinforces what we've been saying. Our next question comes from Ian Wogan. His question is, with such an increase in projected urbanization, how important is an adaptation or adoption of urban forestry management strategies to those of traditional forestry?
As the most urbanized state in the three, let me take this first. As you know, I may have a traditional view of forestry, being educated in the traditional way. Of course, urban forestry is very important, and urban forestry will serve other functions. It increases the quality of life for people dwelling in urban environments. However, I don't think the urban forestry can ever replace, not even close, the rural forestry as far as supplying the wood for our economies. So I'm just going to stop right there.
I'll jump in here real quick. So urban forestry is really important. We know that we're going to have a lot more urban area in our states going forward. There's a lot more people moving into the southern United States. Most of our population is growing in these urban areas. Our population is moving to these urban areas. So urban forestry is going to be important from a couple different standpoints. You got those ecological, social benefits of forests by having trees inside of our urban areas. We can reduce stormwater runoff. We can reduce the heat dome effect of those cities by having trees in that area. There's all kind of studies out there now linking trees and the ability to be able to get out into a forested environment in improvements in your health for individuals, so we can increase the health of our citizens by having trees in those urban areas. But one of the more important things, in my opinion, coming from this, and all of those are super important, but from an industry perspective and from an ability for us to be able to make the case that forests are important going forward into the future, it's our ability to use and leverage all these benefits that urban forests provide to teach this urbanizing population about the benefits of trees and of traditional forest management and all this suite of benefits that our forests provide. There's a tremendous amount of ecological and social environmental benefits that come from forests. And not everybody is aware of how valuable those things are. There's been some studies looking at, valuing the ecosystem services of forest out there, and they come up with really big numbers when they start to do valuation on those. But, leveraging our urban forest to help us amplify our message about traditional forest management and the value of trees is something that's going to be, like I said, it's really important to me, and it's something that we're focused on.
So I'm going to jump in here. We got time for one more question, which is exciting for me because the audience's engagement in this means that there's at least a pulse out there for thinking about these things. I want to also add on to just one last thing from Ian's question. I think that educational component that Scott just brought up in terms of bringing that knowledge set to the urbanization or the urban crowd to help them understand the importance of forestry through bringing the forest to the city is probably some of the things I think Ian might be hinting at here, which is wonderful extension of what the forest capacity is to do other than just maybe provide markets per se. So that's a very exciting moment, I think, for us here in Miami. So the last question I'm going to pose to you guys here is, do you believe we need to rebrand timber products to the general public to re-educate them to understand that the timber industry is not carving away the Amazon, maybe to incentivize sustainability, to increase investment profits, or to promote the sustainability of forest overall? So I'm going to throw that question out there. We're going to wrap up here. And as I said, wait for you guys to kind of respond. Christian's talk will come right after this, and I'll introduce him at the end of these kind of sets of questions.
Yeah, I'll start off on that. Yeah, if we can figure out how to make that case, we'll be doing really well. It seems like oftentimes the forestry is always on defense and we never play offense. And so we've been battling those discussions for decades on what is real forestry and what is not. And that's an example of that. You know, cutting down the Amazon rainforest to grow cows on for a few years and then move to the next area. That's not what we do here in the US. As Scott said in his presentation, the southeastern US is one of the largest, if not the largest, wood basket in the entire earth. And it's equating real forestry with non-forestry is a disservice to the folks that practice forestry like it should be.
I'll just follow up real quick. The answer is yes, we definitely need to rebrand forestry. There's this concept in everybody's mind going back to that timber harvesting is deforestation. I actually, you know, when I was putting my slide presentation together, I put a slide in there and then I pulled it back out because I was thinking I'm not going to have enough time to really go into this, but I put a slide in there showing a cutter, a fellow buncher machine, a piece of harvesting equipment, cutting trees out there. And I was going to ask the question, you know, what is deforestation? And harvesting timber is not deforestation. It doesn't, that's just the end of a rotation. We've grown those trees for a period of time. That crop is right. We harvest that crop, we plant it again, or regenerate it again, and we grow it sustainably, continuously. So harvesting trees is not deforestation. It becomes deforestation when you go in there and you convert that to some other use, whether it be a parking lot or a agricultural field or whatever. At that point, it becomes deforestation. And so, you know, it's something that we battle within the forest community a lot. There's, you know, I've seen a lot of signs while I've been riding around South Carolina, stop deforestation, World Wildlife Fund, you know, showing pictures of the urban rainforest. I mean, the tropical rainforest and where they've been cut, and saying we need to stop deforestation. Deforestation is not a problem in the southeastern United States at this point in time. We continue to have more forested acreage than we have ever had, or we've had since we started measuring records on the amount of forest we have in the southeast. So we do need to work on that and getting that message out. There are a couple of efforts out there to look at that. One that I'm keenly interested in is the hashtag Forest Proud. I don't know if y'all have seen that one, but I would encourage you to go out there and take a look at it. Hashtag Forest Proud. It's a new innovative way of looking at trying to get the positive message about forestry out using social media. And so, you know, it's been doing pretty well. It's still got a long way to go before we can change the hearts and minds of most of the population, but we've got to do that if we're going to be successful in the long term.
Just quickly add that, you know, as foresters, we just pride ourselves on the fact that we not only harvest trees, but we also replant trees and grow the next crop of trees and perpetuate the cycle. So, you know, I agree with both Scott and Risher that forestry seems to have an image problem sometimes, but people just equate perhaps sometimes the worst stories they see on their TV screens or other screens with what's happening around them in their own places where they live. And that's not necessarily the same situation. And we're all very proud that we have continuing and growing our forests in all our states.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to jump in here just because we got to move on to our next presenter, Christian. But I want to say that there was a question by Greg Kingsley, and what we're going to try to do is pose these questions to our panelists here, see if we can convince them to respond. Hopefully they'll respond, and then we'll post that in the Miro board. So we'll have the question that was posed in the panel here, and we'll try to get a response and post those responses in the Miro board for you guys to go check out. I will quickly read the question because I think it's pretty good. All speakers noted that growth exceeds removal. So if growth to drain ratio is high, doesn't that indicate oversupply and poor values for private forest owners? Is the solution still increasing demand? This is a great question, and hopefully we can convince some of our panelists here to address it, and then we'll post that. Yeah. We also have another Q&A at the end of Christian's talk, in which Laura and myself will be back. So again, thank you so much, Scott, Jarek, and Risher. Appreciate your time and all of your commitment to making sure that our land remains fertile, active, and healthy. We look forward to hearing more from you guys in the future, and we'll return. Yeah, we're all going to stay on, but I just wanted to thank you guys before we moved on. So I'm going to introduce Christian now. So Dr. Christian Messier is a professor of forest ecology and urban forestry and science director of the Institute of Temperate Forest Sciences at the University of Quebec, Canada. We want to welcome you across the border virtually. Amongst the many projects Dr. Messier is currently heading up, his work on forest resilience to global changes, investigating network theory and functional diversity approaches to resiliency for fragmented forests, is pertinent to our conversation today. With numerous awards and published papers, reports, and books, his work carries great weight in the conversation of forest health, productivity, and long-term ecological resilience. Dr. Messier holds a PhD in forest science from the University of British Columbia and postdoctoral fellowship in forest ecology from the University of Helsinki. And he was inducted to the Royal Society of Canada. Possibly more interesting though, than anything stated thus far is that he was named the Personality of the Year in Health, Sciences, and Technologies from Radio Canada. It is with great pleasure to have Dr. Messier join us today to share his thoughts on the role of forestry in the midst of global uncertainty. Christian, the stage is yours. Thank you.
I will unmute myself. Thank you, Chris. I will get my presentation. Do you see me? Can you hear me well?
We can both see you, we can see your presentation, and we can hear you well.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this introduction, Chris, especially that it's the only time I get some kind of positive feedback. Usually my students are more critical than my exams are too difficult or that I'm giving them too much work. So it's always fun to get some positive feedback. So it's also, I would call a privilege to be here to talk to all of you, especially to what I will call a new kind of audience for me. I mean, architects is not every day that I have a chance to talk with them. So I think it's a very, very nice, and I'm very pleased to be here. So here is a very brief overview of my presentation. I will have one slide that will talk about the evolution of forestry. We heard very good presentation earlier about forestry in different states in the US. I'll give you a very short view about the evolution of forestry. And then I want to maybe get a bit negative in terms of trying to see what are the threats and uncertainties that we are facing. We talk a bit about climate change, but there's a lot of other threats and uncertainties. And I think forestry has to react to these threats and uncertainties and maybe move to a bit of a different approach that I will present very briefly. But before to go to these new approach, I always like to do a bit of a overview of some what I call promising new concepts in ecology, new concept in forestry that are the base of the next part will be a new forestry that I call as a positive force to increase resilience. You will see, you will hear a lot about resilience in my talk. I believe that forestry can play a very positive role in increasing resilience to these uncertainties, but we will need to modify a little bit the practice we do today, and that's what I will present. So very quickly, evolution of forestry. This is actually a figure that was from a paper that shows, if you look at the evolution, forestry really started almost 400 years ago when there was a shortage of wood in Europe. And what did the early people that developed forestry do is they look at agriculture as a guideline. So for a lot of time, forestry was inspired by agriculture, but over the year, it has evolved. And here the graphic is divided between Europe. In Europe, there is a very popular new approach, which is called close to nature of Pro Silva, which is a forestry that tries to rely more on natural regeneration in a more kind of diversified forestry. And I will say in North America, Ecosystem management has been actually promoted in many places. The idea is actually to do some forestry, do some harvesting, but try to recreate some of the natural disturbances that occur in these ecosystems so that we maintain some kind of range of variability in terms of structure and species so that we can maintain biodiversity. So very quickly, an evolution of forestry, but I think forestry has moved closely more and more to become a bit more ecologically oriented as the time has passed. Threat and uncertainties. This is kind of the very depressing part of my talk, but we've heard about climate change. We know climate is changing, but what we don't know is how much will the change be in 50, 100 years. So that's what I put here, different curves. There are different assumptions about if we stop and really, I will say, reduce our carbon emission today, we can maybe have a mild increase in climate change. But if we continue as we do today, we'll have a great increase in the climate. The problem is we don't know. So when we plant a tree or when we actually determine what we should do, as you know, when we plant a tree or do a management, it's for the next 100 years. And we actually don't know exactly what will be the future climate. Here is an interesting graphic. It's actually come from British Columbia. It is the evolution of the price of timber on a kind of relative scale around 1 over the years, starting in 1930 for different species. And I think there's a tendency, and I think everybody will agree with that, that the price of timber tend to also fluctuate a lot, increase, vary from year to year. So there's more and more uncertainty about what will be the price and probably even what species will be of value in 50 years or 100 years from now. One good example is when I did my PhD at UBC in 1990, the red alder, which is a beautiful tree, was actually removed from the forest. We use herbicide to remove it because we wanted to grow mainly Douglas fir. But now actually red alder has a market. The value is pretty good. And I think now we actually maintain red alder. Other threats are from exotic pest and disease, but also even exotic plants, invasive plants. And here's a map of the world. And the more red dots or patterns that you see is the more exotic pest and disease we have. And unfortunately, when we look at the northeast of the United States, this is where there is the most threat from exotic pest and disease. So this is actually a hot zone there. And actually a recent paper by Gary Lovett and others have looked at all non-native forest insects and pathogens. And they found that actually more than 25 exotic insects and disease that are already present in the US will strongly affect the forest in the US over the next 50 years. This is those that are already here. And of course, every day as we are doing some trading, there is a chance that disease from Europe, from Asia will come and maybe cause some problems. Maybe one of the first event like this was really the chestnut blight, the disappearance of chestnut. Everybody might know that, but maybe the young people have forgot about this, but a big chunk of the eastern US was covered with this beautiful tree, and fungus from Asia that appeared in 1904 really wiped out billions of trees. Actually, it's very hard to find chestnut now. They are usually small, although there has been some effort to reintroduce it with some resistant chestnut. It would take a very, very long time to find that. And I could have gone with many other examples. The emerald ash borer is another example, but there is more and more insects and disease hitting us. And here I'm showing some of newspaper articles that I could gather. This was from the Guardian US edition, an article that says tree damaging pests pose devastating threats to 40% of the US forests. And a very, very recent article in the New York Times, actually on February 6th, I would say a few weeks ago, very nice article about the invasive insects and diseases are killing a forest. And I think they are, when you read this article, when I read it, actually, it shared a lot of my concern about the future of the forest. There are so many threats and uncertainties that the forest is in a way being threatened. And if I look at Europe, I'm actually working a lot in Europe also. This was an article in the Brussels Times that over 40% of the tree species in Europe are facing extinction due to climate change, but also exotic pests and disease. And from Germany, Germany's forest on the verge of collapse. This was actually a very, very severe drought a few years ago that has hit Germany forests, especially the spruce, because a lot of the spruce have been planted in sites where the spruce never grew and it's not very drought tolerant. So there's a big chunk of the forest dying because of the drought. But there are promise, and that's where I want to move next. Promising new concept. I don't know if you've heard about this concept of novel ecosystem. I think that's an important concept. Basically, what it shows, and I don't know if you see my screen and my little arrows, but we are now in most cases when we are managing forests, we are managing novel system because both the abiotic conditions in terms of climate, but it could be nitrogen deposition, acid deposition, other things, and the biotic decomposition with all of the invasive species and new species, we are not managing the same ecosystem or same forest as in the past. And one lesson I think is important is that when we plan the forest of the future, we should not just look in the past conditions, but also in the future, the changing and the increasingly uncertain conditions. So we are forced to make decisions about how we manage the forest, not knowing exactly how the condition in the future will be. The only certainty is that it will be different. Another approach that I think is interesting is this kind of assisted migration. In BC, they are doing it. Actually, they are moving species from Oregon and Washington, not species, actually provenances of the same species that grew in BC, but they are taking southern provinces, moving them in BC, planting them in BC. And it's kind of a way to adapt the forest for the future conditions because BC will probably have a climate like Oregon in the next 50 years. So I think another lesson is that we need to start adapting our forests to the future conditions. And we could modify the genetic composition by actually moving provenances, and we can even maybe start of changing the specific composition. So moving species that are maybe now better adapted to move in novel conditions. Another interesting ecological, I will say, a new concept is this. Lots of studies that have shown that there is a very strong positive relationship between biodiversity and productivity in terms of tree species. Here you have a graphic that summarizes around 750 plots measured everywhere in the world where they have adjusted for all the other conditions. And what it shows is that the more species you have in a forest, the more the productivity increases. And I think this is a very important lesson, is that when you manage forests with more species, you increase productivity because different tree species don't have the same need in terms of water, nutrients, and light. So there is complementarity between species. And I think this should encourage us to maybe manage forests that are more diverse. And another thing that is actually well known in ecology is the link between the diversity, complexity, and even the redundancy in species and the resilience and adaptability of the forest. So here I'm showing the graphic. Basically, the more diversity, the more complexity, and the more redundancy, the more resilience you have. It's not a linear relationship. So I took 3 forests and I look at what will happen in the future with climate change and with exotic insects and disease that might kill more and more species. So if you are in a forest where there is actually a high diversity and complexity, you will lose some species, but you might not lose a lot of the services and the resilience of the ecosystem because you're on the flat part of the curve. If you're in the forest B, you might still be okay, but you will start being on this very dangerous zone where any more loss of species might actually create a big drop in resiliency. But if you are on a forest that has very low species or only one species, you are just one disease and one catastrophe away from what I will call a collapse, where the forest will actually disappear. So this is another important thing to remember. So any reduction in tree diversity and forest complexity tend to decrease its resilience, and it's cumulative. So eventually you might actually have a forest that might sound very healthy, but is actually at one disturbance, one exotic pest or disease from collapsing. Another interesting concept is this portfolio concept in ecology and evolution, or another way to look at it is it's important to not put all your eggs in the same basket. And if you're managing any retirement fund or even your own retirement fund, you're being told, diversify your investment. Don't invest all your money in Tesla or any other company that looks good, because in 30 years from now, you don't know if this company will do well. And I think it's exactly the same in forestry. We should try to diversify the species we plant in an intelligent way so that we reduce the risk. And this is the last part of my talk. I'm just looking about time. I think I still have a good 5 minutes. And just to tell you about two books that one book that I edited and the other book that I co-wrote with two other authors. One is called A Critique of Silviculture, Managing for Complexity, and the other one is Managing Forests as Complex Adaptive System. And these are really the base for this kind of novel approach that I will be talking about. So basically, forestry traditionally has taken forests that tended to be often more diverse and have tried over the year to reduce this diversity to focus on a few key species that are desirable and that are growing well and that produce timber rapidly with a very good high return. So traditional forest management really has always aimed at simplifying and at controlling the system. But I think in the future, with all the uncertainties that are increasing rapidly, we need to change that approach. And that's what I would call the complexity management that is aimed at increasing the resilience of the forest, or even increasing the diversity of possible outcome if you have greater climate change than expected, or if you have disease or insects that you didn't expect. If you have a high diversity system, you are reducing the risk and more likely to have a forest that will continue to provide the many services that we as humans need. So I've written many papers on this. One is a conceptual paper that presents this functional complex network approach. This was written in 2019. And then very fresh from the press, as I could say, is a simulation model where we actually simulated a very large private land in Ontario to look at a simple approach to manage the forest for resilience. And I will show you very quickly, as simply as I can, what is the approach. But one of the first approach is when you look at the forest, instead of looking at tree species diversity, we are actually interested in looking at what we call the functional diversity in terms of key attributes that the trees have, or key function or key traits in terms of response that they will respond to different type of disturbances. For example, if you basically what you want is a very high functional diversity, because you want tree species that will react differently to any kind of disturbance you could have. So since you don't know what will happen in the future, if you have this diversity of trees with very, very large spectrum of functional traits, then you are almost certain that some species might be affected negatively, but some will be affected positively, and you will still have a forest. And linked to this is this question of complex network. Network theory is that when you have a landscape like you see here, and you could calculate, for example, what is the functional diversity of each of these stands. So the greener the stand here, the more diversity of species that have different traits. So it's not just the number of species, but the species that have different traits. And the connectivity means that the trees that are there can disperse their seed from one stand to the other. So if one stand is affected by a disease, then tree species from other tree species will be able to spread their seeds, and then the forest will be able to regenerate naturally with new species, maybe adapted to the new conditions. So if you want to increase the resiliency of a landscape like this, what do you need to do? You need to determine what are the stands that are actually more centrally situated, which one have the lowest functional diversity, and you could intervene in a few stands like it shows here to increase functional diversity of your species. And by doing this, you actually affect a lot of the landscape, because then these stands that have many species that are maybe more resilient to disturbance, if there are disturbance affecting your stands around these stands, the seeds will disperse and the forest will be able to regenerate, and then you will have actually a more resilient forest. So if you compare these two landscape before and after intervention, here you see that functional diversity have increased, but the connectivity has also increased by very targeted, optimal intervention on a few stands that will really, what I will call, increase your immunization from natural disturbance. So these interventions, often when I talk, I say it's like a vaccine. Vaccine is very popular right now, where you could vaccinate a landscape to make it more resilient to global change. So that's about it. I just want to finish with some kind of a conclusion. I see a great potential of forestry as a way to increase our forests, to make it more adaptable, more resilient to the uncertain biotic and biotic conditions. But we need to kind of what I call re-educate a bit the foresters very quickly. When I did my undergraduate in forestry, I was taught that a forester educate the forest to produce timber. I would say that in the last 20 years, we learned that we need and we should produce timber, but there is a need to maintain biodiversity, and that we should maybe emulate a bit more the natural functioning of the forest. But I think the future is more toward how can forestry can be used, of course, to harvest trees, produce wonderful product, but also use forestry to foster, increase the resilience and adaptability of our forests. Thank you very much.
Christian, thank you for that wonderful talk. I'm going to take this moment to encourage, again, the audience to put their questions in the chat. It looks like we have some coming in. But I think I'm going to start by asking you a question that actually gets to the point of what this whole symposium is trying to do, which is to allow architects, designers, people in the architectural professions to look upstream at some of the disciplines and other actors within the context of forestry that can guide us in the decisions that we make to be more powerful for our built environment. So as you talk about the kind of functional diversity in a forest, it leads me to want to ask the question, how can we be better as the discipline of architecture in selecting products or making decisions for our built structures to allow functional diversity to thrive as a model?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, and it's actually very exciting to be able to talk with you guys, because of course, when you design buildings using wood, I think often traditionally you kind of look at some key properties, and then you will decide, I suppose, I need a wood with a certain properties, and then you create a demand. And then traditionally, the forestry world have responded to this demand by growing trees that will go and fit that criteria. But I think if we want to have a forest in the future that is still providing the enormous amount of services, not just timber, and it provides many more services. And if we want to have a forest that is resilient and healthy, we need to consider also the fact that we need a diversity of tree species that may have very different actually attributes. So I will tend to say that the architect should work more closely with the forest that is there and the needs of having a diversified forest, and adapt the way you maybe design your building so that you can use the species that should be there to make it resilient instead of force some special attributes that may be more desirable. And I think there is probably room for a lot of research and innovations in terms of how can we use this whole spectrum of tree species that are out there to produce beautiful buildings and beautiful houses.
I think it's wonderful to hear you talking about it, because the hope is, I think, within the context of Region 8 or the Southeast, and I think the other foresters on this call could also jump in, but I think for us in the Southeast, I think we're looking for this kind of forest to generate a specific type of architecture, an architecture that is, I think, grounded within the woods and the resources that we have here within the region or locally, but also maybe start to drive the way that our buildings are thought through, or maybe their life expectancies, their kind of maintenance cycles, things like this, that actually are tuned to the way the forest is pulsing, which I think is a very exciting moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be wonderful.
So I think from that perspective, we need to depend pretty heavily on hearing more and more and more from our state foresters that are, let's say, on the ground within the context of our region to look locally on that. I guess since this symposium is a global event now because of the pandemic and it being held through remote modality, is that we need to probably start looking locally for some of these questions out of our forests, which is a very exciting moment, I think, for us to rethink architecture in general. So there is a question that came into the chat. I'm going to read it for you here, Christian, and we'll see what you have in response. So it says, you talked about an increase in productivity and risk reduction through diversity. Within an individual stand of trees, high diversity of mature trees can cause management activities to be more difficult, potentially more expensive. So what is the balance point between diversity and management efficiency, or potentially efficacy, I guess, within a stand, and is landscape species diversity more or less valuable than diversity at a smaller scale?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I'm being asked this question all the time. Of course, it depends where you are in the world, but I mean, in Canada, we are still harvesting a lot of natural forest that has many species also naturally. So I think we have developed ways to be able to harvest forests that have 5, 6, 7 species. And of course, it's more difficult. It's probably more expensive. And this is where I will call the ingenuity of the people should come into place. But when I am talking about plantations, because I am actually in favor of having more intensive plantations, we could have plantation with many species and plant rows of species that grow at different rates so that you can harvest your timber in rows and alternate the rows over time, and probably have a fairly mechanized system that will allow to do this. I have actually set up many such plantation in Quebec in the last 10 years. And of course, we are far away from harvesting them, but I think this is something that could be of value. But when we look at the cost, and I think I often saw the next question, there is a cost in increasing maybe diversity, but there is a reduction in risk. And a risk could be put as a value. And that's why I make often the analogy in terms of your retirement saving. Who today, in all the people listen to me, is willing to invest all their retirement money in Tesla? And if you retired in 40 years, who will have the guts to do this? I don't think not many people. But of course, Tesla might become the next IBM, or I don't know what. I mean, it's actually already big, but it could also collapse. We don't know, right? So you want to diversify. I think in the forest, we need to diversify to reduce the risk and make sure that we have some kind of income. And that actually addressed the second question, if you allow me. I think the other question was, how could you convince a private owner to plant a diversity of species when maybe some species are more valuable than others, or some maybe have no value? Well, I will argue again, can you risk planting one species let it grow for 20, 30, 40, 50 years with all the increasing risk that we are facing, to me personally, I will never do that. I think it's too risky. I will much prefer to diversify because I think first, you don't know what is the value of your wood in 40 years, but you know that the conditions will become much more uncertain and that the more you diversify, the less risk you have. And I think to me, it makes sense. And I've always kind of wondered why in forestry, we tend to often go with planting one species over a long period where in any kind of investment for your retirement, you will diversify your investment to reduce the risk. I think we should get inspiration from that.
So we've come to 2:20. Laura, do you have a question you want to ask him, or has he answered everything that could be floating around in your mind?
It looks like we actually just had another couple questions come in, one from Jack Cardno. And I do have one if we have time, but I'd like to, the attendees are submitting them. So Jack Cardno asks, what are the relationships between price of specific species of timber, acreage of standing trees, and technological utilization of timber? Do hybrid models of forestry utilization and conservation exist?
That's a very good question, and it's beyond my ability to answer these questions. I'm sorry about this, but I mean, I will use an example. I work in Panama for many years, and when I was in Panama, teak plantation was very popular. And from what I heard from some economists is, at one point, people were afraid that although teak has a high value, if we plant too much teak, eventually there will be the supply will be higher than the demands, and the price might be very low when we will harvest the teak. And I think it's another good example of why diversification might not be a bad idea. Because if you have too much of a single species, I mean, you may actually have too much wood for the demand of that species, and then the price will go down. I think it's probably a very good idea to diversify. I'm not sure if I addressed this question very well, but as a forest ecologist, it's a bit beyond my expertise.
Laura, if you want to throw your question out there, I think we got like 1 or 2 minutes left. Maybe we can convince Christian to really hit it.
Yeah, absolutely. So in our last presentations, there was a lot of discussion about economics being a driving factor for landowners in the decisions that they make. But there's also been a lot of talk recently about monetizing those ecosystem services that forests provide, like water credits, carbon credits, even biodiversity in some areas. Do you think that the kind of uptick or the rise of these sorts of markets will naturally push our forests maybe in a different management direction, maybe something more aligned with the diversity model?
Absolutely. Actually, I work with many colleagues on this. We believe that very soon we will have market for all of this. Water quality already has a market. You know, if you are in a forest north of New York City, you are being paid to manage your forest a certain way to maintain the quality of the water. So I think this is something that will become more and more important as we know this. Biodiversity is key, not just for biodiversity's sake, but for insects that do the pollination. So I have many colleagues that are working on this. I haven't talked about carbon, but carbon will also become very high value. And I think all of these will be very important. But I will end on one comment, and maybe in the US it's different. But in Southern Ontario and Quebec, we also have a very large land with private owners, but 70% of the private owners don't want to manage their forest for timber or for revenues. They want their forest for other purposes. And actually my challenge is to actually try to encourage them to manage their forest, because a lot of these forests, as far as I could tell, are not being resilient to what is coming in the future. And I think we could harvest some of the trees and use that money that is generated to diversify the forest and make it more resilient. So I don't know if it's like that in the US, but here, if you can convince a lot of private owners that managing the forest is better for biodiversity, water quality, carbon, they will do it. just for timber revenue, it seems to be not an incentive that is strong enough.
That's great to hear. I think in terms of understanding what we need to do to become more resilient, both from economics and forestry and ecology. I want to say, as we terminate this session, a couple things. One, thank you to Scott, Jarek, Risher, and Christian for your time again and knowledge. I want to also thank Laura from the Florida Forestry Association. I want to thank the Florida Forestry Service and the U.S. Forestry Service for everything that they've done to help us get moving here in Florida. The conversation today is just the beginning, and you guys are, from our perspective, at the headwaters that we need to make sure we are actively engaged with. It's our initiatives to make sure that the discipline of architecture includes you guys within its system boundaries, else we will struggle in the near future, not the distant future, the near future. With that being said, again, thanks for your time. This first session is coming to a close. I want to invite all of the participants to venture to your detailed schedule, and you can use the link to join our next panel, which will be Kyo Mo and Ravi Srinivasan and Solomon Craig. Sure to be a very exciting panel in terms of their discussions, and we look forward to seeing you over there. Thank you guys again, and let us know if you have any questions.